first got this camera, I was afraid to take verticals because I'd vignette. .32, is this close? 1/8. That's 32. And here we go. I always look at the subject when I'm taking it. You know, I want to remember it. In 1967, I bought an 8x10 view camera and began this portrait of New Jersey. The larger negatives yielded 12 times the picture area and rendered a complexity of detail that one could study but never memorize. I liked the idea of seeing my picture framed on the ground glass, even though it was upside down. But the principal reason for my choice of such a camera was the tilting back feature. It allowed me to keep the vertical lines of architecture parallel to the sides of the film. Photography and driving went hand in hand. I would decide to go off someplace, and once there, I would continue driving around until I chanced upon something that engaged my interest, something I could take a picture of that would add to my purpose at hand or to the unity of my larger body of work. Whenever that happened, I'd stop the car, get out, and walk around. I would ask myself, do I really want to take this picture? If so, I'll have to get the equipment out of the trunk and set it up. And from where do I want to take it? My experience when driving with most passengers and coming upon something worth looking at was that they seldom understood my excitement or the potential of what I was pointing out until I made a photograph of it. It takes the passage of time before an image of a commonplace subject can be assessed. The great difficulty of what I attempt is seeing beyond the moment. The everydayness of life gets in the way of the eternal. I contemplate how this photograph will be seen in the future when the subject matter no longer endures. Taking a picture is indeed stopping the world. If asked what I have learned since undertaking this work over 30 years ago, I would offer a prophecy in response. All things are subject to change. In my lifelong quest looking for beauty, I managed to find it in places that some would think the most unlikely. In fact, I found it almost everywhere I looked. I remember another maxim my father wrote in my autograph book: beauty lies in the eye of the beholder.
I think I first heard of George maybe 1982, maybe a little earlier. There was an article in a photo magazine, and Ansel Adams was interviewed. And they asked him who his favorite photographers were, and one of the few he mentioned was George Tice. So I had to go out and find out who this guy was. I think the first book I looked at was Urban Romantic. And it really didn't do a lot for me, quite honestly. I was still learning. I didn't know a lot. I didn't really understand the literature as I do now, some nearly 30 years later. And then I've gotten to know George well, become friends with him. I own a few of his prints. And the first print I purchased from him was in 1989. I was working at Maine Photographic, and I bought Car for Sale. And I didn't really know why I bought the picture. I just liked the way it was structured. I like what I call the feng shui of it. It had, everything was organized. It was cool. It had like a '56 Chevy in the picture. Again, I love it. And the picture is amazing to me because I think most people would have driven right by this picture. I think, in my estimation, it is probably perhaps one of the greatest photographs ever taken of the second half of the 20th century, because it shows the American dream unrealized and sort of that paradigm shift in America where things started to go, factories were closing and such. And he shot that in Paterson, New Jersey on Cliff Street. And if you were to go to that location now, you would never find the spot. It's gone. Everything's changed. But you have a car that's in a driveway, most probably a prized possession of a man. And he takes a bar of ivory soap and he writes 2 words. He writes "for sale." It's melancholic. There's a sense of angst. It's sad. It's, they've got the bare trees against the sky. It's cold and gray. And but it just says so much. I think unless you've lived that life, you would never see that picture if you drove by. You would just drive right by it. You wouldn't even be in that neighborhood, probably, first of all. And I think a lot of academics miss that sort of thing. You know, they don't see some of this stuff because they were fortunate enough not to have to live in that world. But George did, and I think by having done so, he has enlarged our vision collectively. Well,
No.
no. Thanks, Dad.
See, with the 6.5, you go like this.
Oh yeah, right. Okay.
I could probably shoot that way with this 8.5. I'll try it. See if
Is that a gold dot?
Huh?
Is that a gold dot?
No.
No.
Oh, this is another one that's tight.
I didn't even know you were not leaving. Thanks, guys. What are you taking pictures for? Habit? Or
Well, I do New Jersey urban landscapes, and they're doing a film of me.
Very nice.
Okay, here we go. Well, it was just me and my mother until I was age 11, and my father was just someone I would visit. She was peddling Irish linen made in Cincinnati, but she'd cut up into a bolt of it into doilies and bedspreads, and she would sell them door to door. And then years later, she was selling pocketbooks door to door. And so she did this practically her whole life. And one time she was mugged in Newark, and then she gave it up. But she might have been 65 years old by then. Work ethic was there from the beginning. I mean, I began peddling the crepe paper roses at about 6 until I was 16. So I was self-supporting as a kid, and I didn't want to ask my stepfather for money. But I bought all my own clothes. I'd go out on Saturdays during school. I'd take a bus with two shopping bags with the crepe paper roses, which get crushed very easily. Had to be very careful. And then I had a newspaper over the top of the bag so people didn't know what I had in the bag. You know, my grandmother said to me, we were out peddling, I guess in New York, and we went through the Bowery, and I remember my grandmother saying, "You don't want to end up here, George." So these were the alcoholics. And when I got the pony, first thing I did was went over to the Bowery. I only made like 2 trips, so all those pictures came from maybe 2.5 rolls of film.
I think that's some of your strongest work. I was looking at it. It's powerful.
Well, it's held up for me for all those 56 years. But I was getting in trouble in school, mostly because of smoking, or, I don't know, cutting up in class, and they'd send me into the boys' room. And then the teacher would come in the boys' room, we'd smell the smoke, and send me down to the principal's office. And then the principal of the Carteret High School got me in his office one day, and he says, what do you really like to do? And I said, well, I like photography. I'd like to be a photographer. And he said, you know, they have a camera club that meets in back at Toth's photo shop in town. You know, that might be good for you. So I went and joined the camera club. I was the only boy. They were all men. I had the Kodak Pony, the $29, 95-cent camera. And they had Leicas and Linhoffs, and they were all men. There was no women in the club.
And he shows up, and he's got this little dinky camera, and I had by then I had a Rolleiflex. I was hot stuff, a kid with a Rolleiflex, and I thought, well, what's this kid gonna do with that camera? And then he brought some prints in, and as I'm talking, I'm getting the goosebumps because this kid's stuff was so good, I couldn't believe it. I talked to George about one of the first pictures I saw of his, and it was kind of an ordinary picture. The scene was ordinary. It was like some storefronts and some lampposts and maybe an awning in there. I can't really remember, but the way it looked, it just caught your attention and it captured your imagination. And it was an ordinary scene, but yet it drew you in. There was something about that photograph, something the way it looked. And I thought to myself, this kid's good.
We had these monthly black and white print competitions. And I began printing with a $10 Spartus slide projector. It would get so goddamn hot, it would buckle the negatives. But I was printing horizontally in the trailer with the slide projector with a cardboard diaphragm, because the light would be so intense. You'd need a shutter speed almost like a camera.
When my father was young, his dad took a lot of pictures of him growing up. And he made these wonderful photo albums that my father would look at, study. I think when he got the bug of photography at 14 and he fell in love with it, he was doing it to get his father's attention and affection and to really show him like, wow, I could be somebody. And when he started doing that, he just took off with it, and that's when he became a perfectionist. You know, it just kept getting better and better and better.
I began winning the awards, and it turned out at the end of the year, I came in second place in cumulative score. So I got the second highest cumulative scores, and they awarded me a trophy, and the trophy was of a warrior holding up, it's in my curio cabinet, holding a flame. And my name was engraved on it. And it was the first thing that I ever really succeeded in doing what I was good at. And when they gave me that trophy, and I said, I mean, that was the linchpin. I'm going to be a photographer. And I never looked back. Well, I was going to vocational high school. I was in the 10th grade and studying commercial photography. So I was only there about 6 months. And I went looking for a job for the whole summer, and it wasn't until the end of the summer that I got a job as a darkroom assistant for a studio in Newark. And I just got the job, so I never went back to school. I made a mistake mixing chemicals, putting the wrong cap on the wrong jar, and the printer freaked out and started yelling, and I started crying, and I left there. If I joined the Navy, I wanted to join the Navy so I wouldn't get drafted in the Army, and I really liked the uniform. But if you joined the Navy when you were 17, you got out one day before you were 21. So you could do it when you just turned 17, or you could do it before you turned 18. So it was called the Kiddie Cruise. So I was in 3 years and 5 months. And then in the Navy, they would not send me to photography school because I was not a high school graduate. But at a party and there was a waiting list of about 100 people who wanted the job in the photo lab. And then they had a party one night for officers and enlisted men, and I had a few beers. I went up and talked to this officer. I said, I'm really in the wrong department for in communications. I said, I'm really a photographer. And so I caught his ear, but I didn't know it at the time. But the next morning I had orders, report to Photo Lab, Naval Air Station for on-the-job training. So it was this one guy, and I went right ahead of these 100 people who were waiting in line. And right before I was to get discharged, the ship was at sea. We're about 300 miles out at sea, and there was an explosion in the hangar bay. And I grabbed the speed graphic and I ran up to the flight deck. And the men were pushing burning helicopters overboard. And that picture went through the wire services to the front pages of newspapers all over the world. And Steichen saw it, and he contacted the Navy. Steichen being a retired, he retired as Rear Admiral, but he was called Captain. He contacted the Navy. They would like to have a print of this for the Museum of Modern Art's collection. And I said, shit, I must be an artist. From 1960 to 1970, I worked as a baby photographer, which I thought would be temporary as a home portrait photographer, going to people's homes, photographing their children individually, family groups, and I used to do about 10 sittings a day. We would do a roll of 120 and then 10 stereo slides. After 5 years, I thought I couldn't do this anymore. And I packed the family up, abandoned the house that we bought. I had $700 in a secret savings account. And we headed out to California with 3 kids in the car, and the car was just packed. Took us about a week to get to California, and I went looking for a job there, and the only job I was able to find was doing home portraits. And the difference was, in New Jersey, I was paid $3.25 for a sitting. In California, they paid $1.50. So I had to do twice as many sittings. And so we stayed in California about 6 months, and my wife got homesick, and we came back to New Jersey. And then I went into business myself, going door to door, selling a coupon for $4.98 for an 8x10 natural color portrait. And I did pretty good with that. And so it gave me half the time to do my personal photography, which is more meaningful to me. And the portraits were just a way of earning a living. I mean, the job I was looking for was artist photographer. I kept buying the Sunday papers when I was doing home portraits. I'd look in the want ad section, look under photography. There'd be a couple of things, but nothing that would give me great satisfaction. Even in portraits, if I was working for a very successful portrait studio, that might have been sufficient. But I think you always have to have your personal work and make it. You got to create your own occupation. We moved to Lancaster early 50s, and that exposed me to the Amish, and they were they were a culture like the Travelers were a culture, and they were fascinating to me. So the trailer camp we lived in, on one side it had an Amish farm, and on the other side it had a Mennonite school. And I used to wait for the school bus and watch the horse and buggies go by. And so that stuck in my mind. So when I got out of the Navy and wanted to begin work on my own, that's the first thing I chose, was to do a book on the Amish and Mennonites of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which I worked on over a period of 9 years, which was a weekend here, a week's vacation there.
The print quality of the book was very important to him in general, and books like Fields of Peace, I think, were just absolutely extraordinarily simply designed and beautifully printed.
I think particularly in his views of the Amish, he does have a romantic sensibility because, of course, they're living very much of a 19th century existence. And so his going and documenting a sort of throwback to an earlier time, I think, does provide a romantic and certainly a nostalgic image of America.
There's just something about those pictures, just that kind of the beauty of the images, the simplicity of the images, just captivated me and interested me.
During that same period of time, I was doing other things, other projects as well. It's all there.
You happy with that?
Yeah.
No.
So what I do is I buff it off so it doesn't dry with the scum.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So I had this heater cord on so that we
So what exactly are you evaluating when you're looking at this?
I'm seeing where I get the minimum exposure for black that reveals the highlight detail. Except that black has to be dodged a little. And it's very seldom that I ever dodge, but this one I do. All these enlarging lenses work different. Some stop down, going to the right, 1, 2, 3, and the filter is in place. I think we can. I think I tried at 35. And then, if it needs a little more richness, I'll soak them the next day and then put them through a 1 to 12. But just the toner. And I never pick up by a sky to drain, because sometimes you can get that runoff. You're heating up the developer when you're holding it there.
So you've been doing this for 54 years. How many years do you think it was before you really started to feel the process?
Not 54, 56.
Oh, 50, okay.
Well, I mean, your idea of contrast changes over time. I look at some prints done in the early 60s. They look too contrasty to me. And well, that's not a bad start.
No, it's good.
Okay, it's maybe a little heavy in here. And maybe I can cut it a little bit. But I know, just from experience, this print is going to be a little lighter than that print. And probably, if this is, let me see if this is light. Let's see if this is lighter, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A little more open.
That fifth pass helped.
I'd say that's it. I think I'll just do another one just like this.
So, what do you remember most about growing up?
Mostly him in the darkroom. He was always in the darkroom. The door was shut, you couldn't open it. You know, you had to knock, wait. And a lot of times he worked, 80 hours a week. And then he would wake us up in the middle of the night, like 2, 3 in the morning, to say hi. And my mother would be, don't wake the kids up. And he would, just want to see us. Yes, we were young and it was really hot. It's about 100 degrees. And we picked out this great spot to have a picnic. And we always had picnics growing up. And we'd run around. Back then you had no shirts on and the girls and boys they looked the same. And they mistake us all the time for boys in the picture. And we had to sit there for quite some time. He got the New York Times where he wanted it. And my sister was off the blanket. She wasn't too crazy about that because we were all nice and cozy on the blanket. And all we wanted to do is have him finish it. And we finally did, and we got to run around, play, and go crazy. Well, he was always working. So even Pleasure was working. We went on a lot of family trips, so we would all get in the car, and we would just travel to places, Pennsylvania for Field of Peace, when he was working on Field of Peace. So we would always go together, and it was crazy because sometimes we would sleep in the car, and sometimes we'd have 6 of us, 7 of us, my brother. We'd all sleep in the car overnight, and we thought it was the best thing.
I remember in particular, one time I had a Girl Scout function, and I had asked him to come to the father and daughter dinner. And he said that he didn't attend things like that. And I knew he probably wouldn't, but he tried his best to make it special for me. But at age 6, I knew that he was different and that I either accepted it or I didn't.
Did he go to the Girl Scout function?
No. He took me out to a really nice dinner, but that's the way it went. He tried to have special time with me in his way. For me, I think I remember the cat series as being my youngest memory of picture taking because I assisted him with those shots. And we followed the cat into the woods, and every time I look at those pictures, I think of that moment. It takes me right back. There's a picture of a cat going out on a tree branch that had fallen over some water. And I remember that picture like it was yesterday, going out and trying to follow the cat, that cat was deaf. So we're trying to follow this deaf cat around, trying to get him to turn our way. It wasn't working out, but he was able to capture the moment.
Was that the white one?
The white one, yeah. All of our cats were white. But it was a magical moment.
this side.
All right, let me...
The sky might go a little hot. We got a car coming. We got a couple cars coming this way. All right, go ahead.
Stop.
Got two more cars coming. Guy taking a left here.
Go.
George was not only a photographer and a printmaker and a craftsman, he was also an archaeologist and a sociologist. No one thought about photographing Paterson, New Jersey.
He's able not only to photograph the buildings, the people, but also the natural site, which I think has inspired him greatly. But he's been almost encyclopedic in the way that he's documented that particular city.
There's a city in New Jersey that's had a persistent attraction for artists and poets. It's Paterson. The town is still attracting attention and people who want to interpret it. And one of the latest is a young photographer, George Tice.
I think the Passaic River is symbolic of the whole city of Paterson. The falls are still beautiful, yet the water is the most highly polluted water in the country.
Yeah, I thought, well, it had these great natural areas. The falls, the river, the mountain, and this being in a valley. And I liked how it was all just contained. Got me at the one-man show at the Metropolitan. Prior to that, it was shown at the New Jersey Historical Society Museum. It won the Grand Prix at Arles as the best photography book of the year. If it's not the most important work I've done, it's right up there. I could work this town and do nothing else the rest of my life. Opened the door, came out, and just looked at us. And I said, "Can you hold it a minute?" And my shutter speed was quite slow. The first one, there was a little blur in her face. And the second one, I got it, which ended up on the cover of Paterson 2.
Paterson 2 was a bit of a revelation because we were all, of course, quite familiar with the original Paterson photographs. So the idea of revisiting and reinterpreting and revisioning a very lively city, but in quiet moments. I think we were all quite pleased and astounded that there was so much more material.
Over 30 years later, going back and making a whole new set of images of Paterson and coming out with Paterson 2. It's quite a tribute to a town.
You started shooting in 1969?
67.
67.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
These positions now is the main
outside?
I'll give it to you. Yeah. Thank you.
And I need the
Meter.
focusing thing. Let's see how it's going here. This thing's the market times. See that?
Yeah.
You were hungry? This is the menu from there. That's a good
Over.
price. Over there in the corner.
Oh, I think that's a diner.
The Mexican diner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let us put it on the other side. Grand. $216. Can't be that much. George came to the workshop, I think, because that's where he needed to be and that's where we needed to have somebody like him. I can't remember who first suggested that George come, but I know at the time he was teaching a master printing class at the New School in New York. And I think somebody suggested to us that he'd be perfect to come up and teach at the workshop. So we invited him up. He knew Maine already because he'd already released Seacoast, Maine. So he knew Maine, and this was a good opportunity for him to get up here and we'd pay his way. I think workshops really sprung up with this interest in photography when they were being shown in museums and galleries. That's when I could do in a summer, maybe do 6 workshops. I think George taught process. He taught you what it took to realize a good print. He showed his steps that he would go through in the making of a print. He would show his test prints. He would show prints that didn't work, prints that did work.
He would teach people big ideas that were important, that were fairly simple ideas about a print is either too flat or the right contrast, or it's too contrasty, and a print being either too dark or too light or correct.
Ansel Adams, I gave 2 workshops with Ansel Adams in Yosemite. Maine Photographics, I taught there almost 30 years, maybe 29 years or so. And I loved going up to Maine in the summer. It was a great break to get out of New Jersey and get up where it was cooler and I could photograph up there. For most of the time, we did a field trip one day and we'd go out and drive around. That wasn't so easy to do, and it was hard for me to teach somebody to photograph. I could look at their ground glass and suggest if they're on a tripod and suggest how they might improve the composition. I could take a meter reading and see how they're exposing. But I felt that I could only teach people how I do something.
It allowed you to spend a week totally devoted to photography, which most people never did. So here we're off in an idyllic place on the coast of Maine where there's lots of subject matter, and you're sequestered with a group of 10, 15 other photographers and one particular person who's drawn you there. That's the master who's teaching the class. Now, you'll learn a lot of technical stuff, and you make a lot of pictures. Some of them are terrible, but you learn a lot. And one other thing I thought was always important is you got to know somebody who was successful at doing what you love to do. And you learned from them about attitude, about persistence, sticking to it, craftsmanship, how long it took to do something. To make a master print may take you 10 years before you get to that level of mastery where the print now sings to you.
Now in Photoshop in the afternoon.
No electricity, so I'd have to get it.
It was
charged each night with the
brand new in
generators.
1969.
Right there. I hate when the I had your
Fourth.
quarter 45. I was hoping you'd take it though. You want two?
Yeah.
Good.
What time is it?
5:05.
10 minutes.
That's good. That's about average.
Well, you could do a whole book today.
My recollection is that I met George and Lee Whitkin at the same time. Lee was starting his gallery, the first version of his gallery in Manhattan.
But he credits Lee Whitkin of the Whitkin Gallery in New York with freeing him to pursue another area of photography, urban landscapes.
In a lot of George's work, the landscapes and the buildings, there's that quality of light, that quality of loneliness, that very American quality, not only in feeling but design.
Lee was at the gallery, and George had really been instrumental in getting Lee involved in photography and educating him about photography and encouraging him to start a gallery in New York, which was a very daring thing to do in 1960, was it late 68, early 69.
There was a sea change there. You know, I was helping Whitkin. He wasn't a photographer. He actually was a writer for a construction magazine, but he learned very, very quickly and became an expert on the history of photography and who's who in photography. But I was his first show in 1969. He was selling enough prints that I could stop the commercial work and just fall back on the print sales. You know, they started off at $25 and gradually went up.
APAD's the World Series of Photography. It's the best dealers in the world that specialize in photography. It's not contemporary photography, it's not vintage photography, it's everything, but it's the best of everything.
He's been coming here for over 20 years, and he is presenting his book, American Beauty, at Nailia Alexander Gallery.
Yeah.
What is it about the paper that
The
you like so
fi-
much?
the sheen.
The sheen of it.
Probably 20, 25 years. I fell in love with his work when I started to collect, and when I opened my first gallery, George was one of my first exhibitions.
I'm based in Santa Monica. So I'm an Englishman, but I like George because he helps me explain America to me. He's the quintessential American chronicler. Hey, what do I know about a white castle, you know? We didn't have those growing up in London.
Who's doing the printing?
Salto and Olbeek, Belgium.
Belgium, yeah.
Sign back here. Where's Nadia?
I've always been very touched by the Artie Van Blarcom project.
I read the book Death of a Salesman, and that, I thought it was a masterpiece. And that informed my vision when I did Artie Van Blarcom. Artie Van Blarcom was like Willie Loman. I was in Vailsburg Camera Club. Artie was a member of Tri-County Camera Club. And so I contacted Artie. I'd like to do a book about him. And he said, "How much is it going to cost me?" We were sitting in a diner, and I told him it wasn't going to cost him, but I would be photographing him at home, at work, with him out photographing, kind of like what you're doing with me. All his pictures were cliches of camera clubs, cute dogs, a lot of puppies, all the spots that the other camera people went. There's a good picture there he would go to. I mean, nothing was really an original idea, but I liked his prints because they were so sloppy. His retouching, he would paint in seagulls. He would take oil paint and make clouds. So his hands were all over them. And he'd give them such cute names. A dog licking a kid's face, Hot Licks, I think it was called. And grew to really like him and gave him a lot of attention.
There's something about that project that seems to me to be very, in a certain way, autobiographical. So sort of a there but for the grace of God go I, without any sarcasm, just a kind of a very sweet, touching attention to a camera club photographer. A lot of the college-educated photographers of his generation would have sneered on some level or looked down on the camera club folks as this kind of throwback to an earlier generation in photography and a kind of a vestigial thing, whereas George saw them as his sources of knowledge. So I think it's not a matter of sympathy or identification with them. He is or was one of those folks.
I was at the Whitkin Gallery at an opening, and Lee Whitkin told me that Arthur Miller and his wife Inga Morath were coming. And I had forgotten that I illustrated some of his writings, and I did one on, he wrote a short story on fame, and they used my White Castle to illustrate it. So when I met him, and Lee Whitkin introduced us, he said to me, "You're George Tice?" And I had sent him a book, but he didn't respond to it. And he smacked himself in the head. And he said, "You're George Tice?" And he smacked himself in the head again. He said, "I loved your book." And that was like God saying that to me. Other books, Ansel Adams wrote back in a very complimentary way about Fields of Peace, and that was his wife's favorite, one of his wife's favorite books, Virginia. And then I sent him a second book, Artie Van Blarcom, and he sent me this letter that depressed me. He didn't think Artie was an interesting guy. He didn't think this is what I should be doing. And I know in time you'll do this and that. But it really bummed me out. Right. So I have the two letters too. The one with the applause for Fields of Peace, and then the Artie Van Blarcom. He didn't think that was my calling.
I knew no one else's father was having gallery openings, and I saw how people respond to him. And that's when I realized that my father was famous.
I have known George Tice for a long time. admired him as a photographer and known his history with connection to other photographers. And a while ago, we had clients that were interested in Steichen, and knowing George's relationship with Edward Steichen as his printer for a long time, I contacted George and went up to see him at his house in New Jersey, where he surprised me by pulling out a big box of prints that he had made for Edward Steichen's retrospective at the Whitney in 2000. Then George started sending me unseen photographs of his, and I said that would make a great accompanying show. So the room that we're in now has a group of 12 photographs, which we're calling Seldom Seen, and they are, with the exception of one picture, seldom seen George Tice pictures. And the fact that we can come up with 12 pictures that are this great by George Tice, I think, shows the depth of George. I mean, that was really the point of the show, and also the pleasure of the show was in linking these two photographers together publicly, where their photographs had not really been shown in this way, but there was a friendship, there was a more than legitimate association, and that people could appreciate George's work at the same level of mastery that Edward Steichen's work is being seen.
In my mind, what makes a great photo book is great pictures, but it's a lot more than that. It's got to be a whole lot of great pictures to end up with a book.
Because he's not distracted by either by constant travel to events all around the world, because he stays in one place pretty much, and because he's not so involved in all of these other aspects of professional activity that a lot of people do get involved in, conferences and this and that, he's got a lot of time to spend on his work. And I think that's a choice that he's made. It's also his personality, but I think that's a choice that he's made, and that's where he's put his focus. And therefore, he does build projects and conceives of his work, interestingly, as projects and as book-length projects.
One of the things he told me was that books were his major focus. Ernst Haas said the same thing. My pictures are meant to be seen in books.
Always a book. Always a book. Some were just series, tree series, ice series, aquatic plant series. But mostly a book, and mostly about place. I became enthralled with Lincoln, just how intelligent he was, how wise he was, how he was self-educated. And I became a great admirer of Lincoln. And then one day I was coming out of the Newark Museum, across the street, there's the Lincoln Motel and Abe's Disco. And I said, well, this is it, if there's this kind of thing all around the country. But there wasn't that kind of thing all around the country. I think there were more things that used Lincoln as a namesake earlier, when there were still people alive who were living during his lifetime.
The Stonewall's Gray Skies Yorkshire book I love a lot. It's a wonderful book of a place. I think when it came out, I was totally surprised by the book, and to see him look at a land that was so fitting to him from so far away was a real treat.
He just ran out of the car, ran up to the rock, and crawled up it. And I just got a couple of frames. And there was just one frame where his whole outline was just perfectly configured. And I loved the picture and used it on the cover of the book. Well, that was another retrospective. Godine contacted me and practically begged me to do a book for him. He wanted me on his book list. And he wanted to, at first he wanted to republish Patterson or Urban Landscapes. And I told him no, I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to do a retrospective. This was in '82, so the previous one covered from 53 to 73. That was 7 years later. I had a lot more work. And we published Urban Romantic, which title came from a review that was titled The Urban Romanticist. And I said to Godine, how's that for a title? And he said, well, nobody will be able to pronounce Urban Romanticist. How about Urban Romantic? And that became its title.
Urban Romantic, I think, for me was probably, you know, the most important book in the book. You would sit and study this a lot, or I would sit and study a lot. The sequencing of the book, printing of the book, the design of the photographs. Individual prints, almost all of them can stand on their own, but the sequencing and how they play off of each other in a book form is, you know, I think adds a lot to your knowledge of the work, and just the amount of work he would do for a book like Lincoln, the amount of travel and effort that was made to make a book like that is quite extraordinary. Yeah, there were benches out in front of the bookstore, and he would sit on the benches quite a bit, and be smoking some. And but all of a sudden, a lot of people would kind of figure out that it was George Tice, and then kind of word would spread, and then there'd be a lot of people there, and he'd be signing books to a lot of different people, which he seemed kind of very, happy to do. When a book is an extraordinary book is kind of a rare thing, even though there's a lot of science behind printing and publishing a photo book, there's a lot of art to it as well.
I think the D-Max came up a little light, and Peter was pushing some weight into the shadows and trying to still pull the detail out on the right and on the left side there.
Okay. So I know there isn't much detail in here. In the negative, there is not much shadow detail there. But I'd like to keep that, what we can of the cars.
Yeah, that's excellent.
So this is the final.
That's the final.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, I think we're ready for press.
Yeah.
Both over there. So that one's pushed back a little bit, and you can see here this is the same. This is pushed back, and that is like a half stop down.
The reason I took this picture is because I think it shows compassion, like to the woodsman, don't cut that tree down idea. You'd have to build a little island around the tree. I think most construction people would have just cut the tree down and used that space for the driveway, parking lot. Now it's saved and it's a little island unto itself. And you can see how well the reproduction looks compared to the original. Quite nice.
Well, I actually met George in, I think it was about 75. And I saw a show of George's work, and I was very enamored, being a Jersey girl, of the vision he had of New Jersey. And it wasn't the pretty side of New Jersey, and I found that incredibly fascinating because they were such technically beautiful photographs. And we started a romance rather quickly, and I think most of it was hinged on our love of photography, and I was just intrigued by his work and his vision and his sheer determination as he worked. He was so focused, and I was really impressed by that. And being a young student of photography, I also had so much to learn from him, and I did. Well, I really don't like my picture taken, so it was a little difficult, and I think it was difficult for George too, because I think I was one of the few people that he photographed. Everything he photographed was static, and I think it was quite challenging for him. And I think he convinced me that it was important to do this work. I was also only 21, and he told me that someday I would actually cherish these photographs, as much as I hated having my picture taken at the time. And that proved to be true.
Well, I first saw the oak tree on the Garden State Parkway heading north. And although I couldn't see the whole tree, even from the slow lane, I see the top of the tree. And I think once I pulled the car over and actually looked over the side and got a look at it. And then I was planning on photographing it, and it was in May, and the leaves were just starting to sprout. I took it in bright sunlight, but it was like too contrasty to look at. And I waited for the sun to set, and it was still bright enough. And I think I did a 1 second exposure. There's a little movement in some of the leaves blowing softly. Developed a film, made a print, thought I had a great picture. I made it 16 by 20, but I didn't have a good quality enlarging lens, so it's not as sharp as later printings, but I took it into the Museum of Modern Art, and I bought it on the spot. John Sharkowski. Bought it on the spot. And then I was surprised. I came to the Museum of Modern Art one day, 2 Museum of Modern Arts back. So we're talking 1970. And there it was hanging. And I was very pleased. If I took a date to the Museum of Modern Art and they see my picture there, that was pretty good. I don't know how many years it hung. My guess is in memory, about 3 years, and became very famous. Was reproduced all the time. Sold a lot of prints of it, almost on a weekly basis. I was printing this negative. A lot of people say it looks like an etching, all the detail everywhere. And it's a funny thing because I overexposed it and it was dense. And I took the chance on reducing it, bleaching it. And it worked out nicely because it just like cleared the shadow areas to give me a good rich black in the shadow areas.
And I, of course, fell in love with his work, and I was so happy when he agreed to become a part of the gallery. So this is the first time, actually, this is the first show that I'm hosting for George. And it's, I think, the first time we're showing entire 16 photographs, platinum palladium photographs. So it's very exciting.
Are you looking to purchase one?
Well, I keep asking that from my husband what was his favorite, and I thought I might buy it for Christmas, but we'll have to see.
A lot of his photographs have that sort of opera-esque feel.
The solitary.
He's been very steady throughout the years and literally true to himself. No, commercial, I've got to change my style, nothing. He's been very dedicated to what he's doing. And a great man and a good spirit in the field of photography.
Yeah, they're gone. Took in 1974.
No kidding. Are you George?
Yeah.
Oh, nice to meet you. Oh, so you were here in 74 and this is the same
Right.
as it stood. Isn't
Right.
that amazing?
This is my most famous photograph. Well, I was always coming up the turnpike to visit a girlfriend who lived in Cherry Hill. And this Luck Oil was a mobile station. And every time I'd pass it on the turnpike, I think I'd like to get off and see what it looks like up close. And I did. And I got here, it was a little later than this. Not quite twilight, well enough that I can compose it on the ground glass. And so I started my exposure, I think it was two minutes. It was either 2 or 3 minutes that I was trying to add up. But the station was a lot busier then, so a car would pull into the station every few minutes. I'd have to stop the exposure. Now it would be easier to do with a countdown timer, but they didn't have countdown timers then. But the exposure wasn't critical, because if you say 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes, it's not a big deal. Well, when I left here, I thought I had a great picture. But it was too contrasty to contact 810. But the first prints I made were contrasty 8x10. But then once I put it in the enlarger, the cold light would soften the contrast and make it all fit. So the only way it works as a contact print is in platinum, because it's a good negative for platinum printing. The White Castle preceded this, and that became a famous photograph. And then this one kind of surpassed the White Castle in how people appreciated it.
be perhaps your number one?
Yeah, it's the number one.
Yeah.
And I may never do a picture greater than this. If I live another 50 years, I'll be 122. And I don't think I'll make a greater picture than this.